Hello and welcome to the first GCSE Geography revision session. This one is going to be looking at the exam structure for the Edexcel Specification A papers, more specifically papers 1, 2 and 3, and what you can expect to encounter as you go through the exam series. So this slide just shows you a general overview of all three papers side by side, and it shows you that all three of them are divided up into three sections, A, B and C. So going into more detail and starting with paper 1, you can see that section A consists of 30 marks, section B 30 marks, and section C is 34 marks. The 4 extra marks are awarded for spelling, punctuation, grammar and specialist terms on one particular question at the end of that topic. So section A in more detail, which looks at changing landscapes of the UK, and this is by far the longest topic with the most content that you will study throughout your time at GCSE Geography. There's lots more content that you'll learn than will actually appear on the paper. So it will begin with sort of 6 marks, which are available for the changing landscapes of the UK in general. So they're going to be short mark questions, because being only 6 marks means they can't really squeeze in a really long essay type question. And the topics that you might be asked about are UK rock type characteristics and their formation. So igneous, metamorphic, sedimentary, examples of those. You'd need to know examples of them. You'd need to know where in the UK you might find them, but you'd also need to be able to explain how they are formed. Upland and lowland landscapes, so the difference between the kind of northwest of the UK, which is upland landscapes with mountainous areas and generally harder rock types, and then the lowland southeast areas, which are generally softer rock types. The historic factors which have affected the UK landscapes, and these are physical factors. So these are factors that before humans existed shaped the UK's landscape as we know it today. So tectonic processes, glacial processes during the last ice age, and also river and slope processes. But alongside that, you'll need to know about how recent human factors have also affected the UK's landscape, because undoubtedly we've changed the landscape that we live on through mainly farming, forestry and settlement. So those are the 3 things that the exam board focus on. Now remember, this is only worth 6 marks. They're all going to be short questions. You'll have multiple choice questions in here. You might have to have labelled diagram questions, but there's not going to be any big long essay questions. Now, unusually for any single section, there are 2 8-mark questions in section A, but there are things that we can definitely say about them which will help you out. So the next part of section A is looking at coastal landscapes and processes. So this is worth 12 of the 30 marks, and 8 of those 12 marks come from one 8-mark question, and it's an examine question. It will always be the command word examine. Now there is another PowerPoint, another revision tutorial which talks you through both 8-mark questions, so all the types. Again, there's only 3 types. Of those 3 types, examine is one, and it'll tell you the structure that you can follow, which works every time for examine questions. But also there's loads of examples that you can practice on, and then write down and hand to me for me to mark, to just practice doing examine questions. It's definitely worthwhile doing, considering it's worth 66% of this part of the paper. So what you could be asked about for coastal landscapes and processes is geological structure. So you've covered geology types in the first part of this paper, looking at the UK rock types and their formation, etc. Geological structure is how those rock types are laid out. So at the coast, we talk about discordant and concordant coasts. So think of stripy rock structures. Are the stripes facing the sea, or are they perpendicular or parallel to the oncoming waves? Alongside that, you'll be looking at physical processes that occur at the coast, including weathering. So the weathering can include biological, chemical, physical, erosion types, hydrabatsol, mass movement, transportation, tresaltosol, deposition, constructive and destructive waves, and all of those things added together really will help you answer the next part of this, which is looking at landforms. So landforms of coastal landscapes, things like cave arch stack stump, bay and headland, that sort of thing. How those landforms are created is likely to be something you might be asked about, and they are created using those physical factors that affect coasts. Weather and climate and how that's affecting coastlines, and things like coastal flooding. And lastly, you'll need to have a case study. Now, a case study is a detailed, in-depth knowledge about a particular coastal location in the United Kingdom, and we cover the Holderness case study because it's so well known and it's very, very relevant, one of the fastest eroding coastlines in Europe. So the coastal landscapes and processes will have a few short questions, 4 marks worth of short questions, and then one big 8-mark examine question. Now the next part is river landscapes and processes, which is exactly the same structure as the coastal landscapes and processes section. It's worth 12 marks of the 30 overall. There'll be one 8-mark question in there and 4 short mark questions. So the 8-mark question will again be an examine question. So again, if you practice the using the 8-mark questions made easy PowerPoint that's available, if you use those practice questions and then hand them in to me, then you can really get nailed down these examine questions. So what you could be asked about in that particular section is about the river's long profile from source to mouth and the Bradshaw model. So how rivers change from source to mouth, what happens to the velocity, what happens to the width, the depth, what happens to the sediment size, all that sort of stuff. You will also need to look at the physical processes that affect river landscapes. Luckily, a lot of these are given the same name as those that affect coastal landscapes: weathering, erosion, mass movement, transport, and deposition. River landforms, things like floodplains and levees, waterfalls and gorges, oxbow lakes and meanders. Weather and climate and how that is also affecting river landscapes. Again, more specifically, things like river erosion or river flooding. Human activity and flooding in a general section, and a case study again, the River Dee case study in this case. Now, you'll notice there's an extra little section underneath here, which is if we were studying glaciated upland landscapes and processes, but we don't do this. The reason we don't is because you don't need to study all 3 coasts, rivers and glaciated upland landscapes. You'll only have to do 2 of the 3. So we've chosen coasts and rivers because the types of erosion and weathering and mass movement are effectively very similar, and therefore you don't have to learn extra content, well, more than you need to know really. So the glaciated upland landscapes and processes section, this is really important. You do not answer it. Okay, just skip it. Make sure you go back through it, just check that you haven't answered that and wasted time. So once you've done rivers, you're ready to do the next section. So the next section is worth another 30 marks, and this one is about weather hazards and climate change. Now this one is divided up into 2 kind of parts. The first part is climate change in general. And within that, there are 7 marks available. So again, it's not particularly worth loads and loads of marks, this part. 7 marks is similar to the first section of the first part of section A, which is only worth 6 marks. So they're going to be short mark questions. Might be multiple choice. You might have to label a diagram or something like that. You might have a small explain question to extend, but you could only be asked about global atmospheric and oceanic circulation, which sounds horrible, but remember there is a PowerPoint which talks you through and revises the entire content for section B, so you can look that up if you're not sure. Natural and human causes of climate change, including kind of what humans are doing in terms of industry and agriculture and energy production. And we look specifically at the UK's climate, so how the UK's climate varies from north to south and what the difference is or what causes those variations. So things like relief and whether it's a prevailing wind or air masses, that sort of stuff. Okay, so that first part of the climate change, weather hazards and climate change section is worth 7 marks. They're short mark answers, lots of kind of science in there. And again, I'd urge you to go on to the revision PowerPoint for section B of topic 2, which is weather hazards and climate change. Now, the second part of this obviously is worth 23 marks because that's what's left. And there will be one 8-mark question in there. So this 8-mark question will be either assess or evaluate. So whereas you've got examine questions for section A, that is really the only time you'll see an examine question throughout all of the 3 papers. All the other questions that are 8 markers will be assess or evaluate questions. So this is where we start to look at the specific hazards associated with weather. And this is quite cool stuff. So we look at tropical cyclones, how they're formed, what hazards they create, and with case studies of Hurricane Sandy and Typhoon Haiyan. The reason we've got 2 case studies here is because you might need to compare those case studies with kind of how they responded or the damage that was caused. And that's why one of the case studies, Hurricane Sandy, is in an MEDC, or more economically developed country, and the other one, Typhoon Haiyan, is in a less economically developed country. You would then look at drought, which is kind of the opposite end of the scale, where you don't have enough rainfall, and so therefore it leads to things like starvation and desertification. And we look at the causes of drought with, again, a comparative case study, one of California in the USA versus Ethiopia in Africa. So it's a very kind of good assumption that your 8-mark assess or evaluate question is going to be about one or more of the case studies for either tropical cyclones or for drought. And again, on the 8-mark questions made easy PowerPoint, there is loads of different potential questions that you can practice, which you can try out and see how you go. Okay, so that's section B. Now the last part, section C, only has one kind of question throughout, so it's not divided up. So that entire section is worth 34 marks, with the 4 extra marks being because of spelling, punctuation, grammar, and specialist terms. And they will appear in an 8-mark assess or evaluate question. Again, there is a technique to answer all assess and evaluate questions, so don't panic about that. Now, the content this could be drawn from is world ecosystems or biomes, so deserts, tundra, tropical rainforests, deciduous forests, etc. You'll need to know about where they occur, how big they are, and you'll also need to know about some of the conditions you would expect to find there. Okay, it's not going to give you a table of information. You need to know that deserts receive less than 250 millimeters of precipitation all year. That is a definition of a desert. You can't just say deserts are dry. That's not specific enough. You also need to be aware of maybe some of the plants and animals and vegetation types that live in those biomes, and you'll need to be aware of the soil, and is the soil acidic, is it fertile, is it thick, is it thin, that sort of stuff. Then you'll need to know biosphere resources, so what things that we get from the living world and the living parts of the world, with a focus on UK ecosystems is kind of another section, so looking at heathland, moorland, wetland, woodlands. And then we go into more detail about 2 of the world's biomes. Okay, one of the world's biomes is tropical rainforests, and within that section, or I've abbreviated it to TRF here, within that section you have adaptations of tropical rainforests, goods and services they provide, deforestation and what's causing it, how climate change is affecting tropical rainforests, and how it is being managed sustainably, with a case study of the Amazon rainforest. You'll need to know about specific things they're doing in the Amazon to help manage sustainably the problems associated with climate change and deforestation. Then there is almost an identical section, but this time for deciduous woodlands, where you look at adaptations, goods, services, deforestation, climate change, sustainable management. But you also look at a case study in the UK, which is the New Forest. So you need to know specifically ways that the New Forest is being managed to try and overcome these problems of climate change or deforestation. So that summarises all of paper 1 in a very short space of time, and it's quite intimidating to look at how much content there is there. I would say that the first part, like I say, section A of paper 1 is particularly tricky because there is so much content there and you're not going to be asked about all of it. But there are some things that will help you along the way. Knowing the structure is part 1. You know what's going to be coming up. Okay, so moving on to paper 2. This paper is the human geography side of things. So just like paper 1, there are 3 sections, and they are worth 30 marks, 30 marks, and 34 marks respectively. So section A is one big section looking at changing cities. So this is worth 30 marks. It will include one 8-mark question, which will be assess or evaluate. And the types of information you could be asked about here could be about world urbanization in general. So what is urbanization? How are cities changing? UK urbanisation more specifically as well. And those 2 sections really you're likely to have some maybe short mark questions on. Where you're going to get the more detailed explain questions and have a bit more information to kind of put into the paper is through the next sections, which are your 2 massive case studies. So one of the case studies you looked at is Norwich, and you need to know basically everything there is to know about Norwich, its context, its structure, how it's changed in terms of population over time, why those changes have occurred, how economically Norwich has changed. What was Norwich used to be famous for example, textiles, and what is it more famous for now? How Norwich has massive inequalities, why some parts of Norwich, your life expectancy can be up to 10 years lower than other parts of Norwich, for example. How Norwich's retail industry has changed. So again, looking at how the city centre has changed and throughout time, what shops have gone, what shops have returned. Also looking at sustainable strategies to improve Norwich. And there's always things going on in every city, and Norwich is no exception. There are always things being used in the town council and nationally to try and improve Norwich and make it maybe a slightly more green city. And then you will have questions about Mexico City specifically. Again, Mexico City is a contrasting case study because it's a city in a less economically developed country. So again, you have to know about the context and structure. But because it's an LEDC city, you need to know about rapid growth. Norwich hasn't undergone rapid growth, so the questions about rapid growth can only be about Mexico City. Inequalities, again, just like Norwich, and strategies to improve the city's problems in Mexico City as well. Now, the 8-mark question is going to be about one of these two case studies. I don't know which one, but it's likely to be about one of these two case studies and one of the sections in lots of depth. So you need to know specific information, detailed data about either Norwich or Mexico City. So you need to know those two places really, really well. Okay, section B for paper 2 is global development. So it's also worth 30 marks and will also include one 8-mark assess or evaluate question. Now, this could be looking at defining development or measuring development. So using things like development indicators, things like healthcare data or human development index information. Also looking at patterns of development. So how have places, namely India, but how have places developed over time? Uneven development, why some places develop faster in some parts than others. So, for example, you could use the UK as an example here. London has developed much more quickly than other parts of maybe, say, the northeast of England, or maybe in the sort of far northwest of Scotland. Why is it that that's the case? International strategies, so ways in which the development can be boosted by international cooperation and maybe world loans, for example. And investment. We look at top-down versus bottom-up strategies. So top-down, from government or national or even international level, and how that can benefit filtering down, or smaller projects that help to aim to help benefit communities and improve things from the bottom up. But where you're likely to get your 8-mark question is going to be with your knowledge about India specifically. So you will do a case study on India, including where it is and its context historically, how India has developed unevenly and how that's changing, how India trades with the rest of the world, its aid, the support that India receives from other countries and investment from other countries, how the population of India is changing. And India is currently the second most populated country in the world, but it will overtake China at some point. All the predictions are that it will do so. Geopolitically, that's quite interesting stuff. That's how India kind of interacts with other countries around the world. And basically, it's got beef with some countries, like China, for example, but it's good friends with other countries like the UK, for example. But also we're looking at the impacts of rapid development in India, because India is undoubtedly one of the fastest developing countries in the world as well. So that's, again, a really super interesting topic and section, but your 8-mark question is likely to need you to know quite a lot about India with regards to specific information and detail. Now, the last section for paper 2 is divided up into 2 main parts. And this is the resource management section. So the first part is resource management in general. It's worth 10 marks of the 34. And it's going to be about where the world's natural resources, coal, oil, gold, diamonds, iron ore, that sort of thing, are found and located, and why they're distributed where they are. Then we'll look more specifically at the UK's natural resources, because we've got quite an abundance of natural resources in the UK, and that allowed us to develop quite quickly during the Industrial Revolution. And also global consumption of resources, so how we are using these resources, and often we're using them a bit too quickly. That's the first part of this section, but by far the biggest section, worth the most marks, 24 of the 10, including the 8-mark question, is energy resource management. So it's worth 24 of the 34. There's 4 marks for SPAG on the 8-mark assess or evaluate question. So really, there's a 12-mark question here. Now, what's included in energy resource management is knowledge of renewable versus non-renewable energy, and with a specific focus on wind energy and coal. So you need to know a bit more detail about wind and coal as renewable versus non-renewable sources. You'll need to look at the UK's energy mix, so the different sources that the UK gets its energy from, and be able to compare that with other countries. For example, Iceland and India, we look at in a lesson and about how they get their energy. The impacts of non-renewable energy resources, so things that, problems with developing coal, oil, gas, but also, there are positive impacts too, so be aware of those. And the impact of renewable resources, so what are the benefits and problems with things like wind, solar, and hydroelectric, for example. Ways that we meet energy demands, because energy demands, you'll see, are only going up. Ways in which we can try and help meet those demands. And again, like with lots of human sections, there are case studies that are really important. So in this section, China and Germany, we look at in good detail with regards to how they are trying to make their energy resources more sustainable. So Germany, you may remember from the session, we look at Energiewende and how Germany wanted to shift from nuclear to essentially more wind and solar power, and how China has, again, invested in lots of renewable energy strategies, for example, the Dabancheng wind farm. So the benefits and the negatives of those particular schemes. Now, lastly, again, there's another little section here. Just like on every single paper, there is a bit you don't answer. Very usefully, this one is right at the end of section C. So you don't answer water resource management. Make sure if you've got to that section, hopefully, if you've answered energy resource management well, you've used up your time wisely. You wouldn't have even time to answer water resource management accidentally. But pay attention to the fact you do not answer that last section of section C. Okay, that summarises paper 2. And again, there's lots there, particularly here, case studies and knowing Norwich, Mexico City, India, and Germany and China in lots and lots of depth, because that is going to be critical to getting the highest marks. So paper 3. This, just like the other two, is divided up into section A, B and C, but it's a bit more straightforward. Section A is the physical geography fieldwork. Section B is the human geography fieldwork, and section C is about UK challenges. So this whole paper is worth fewer marks, and it's not as weighted heavily because the content is not so intense with regards to what you need to learn. It's more about, do you know about fieldwork in general and any fieldwork that you've carried out specifically. So section A is looking at physical environments, and you will have covered rivers as your physical environment. So there will be a question on coasts, but you do not investigate that whatsoever. So the coast section, there you go, I've crossed it out at the bottom there. You do not answer the questions on coasts. You only answer the physical fieldwork questions on rivers. So this is worth 18 marks. 8 of those marks are for with an 8-mark question, and they'll ask you potentially about formulating inquiry questions. So, they might show you a photograph of a place and say, what geographical questions could you answer, or could you ask, about this place? And looking at geographical theory. So when we looked at rivers, the theory is probably going to be something along the lines of the Bradshaw model, because we tend to investigate the Bradshaw model when we look at rivers. It will ask you about how to collect data, different ways you can collect data in rivers. So what you need to use for example, tape measures, velocity flow meters. How do you measure width? How do you measure sediment, for example? Sampling techniques. Why didn't you measure every single pebble in the river, and how did you decide what sampling technique to use? How do you present the data you've got when you've got it? So what graphs do you put it into? Do you put it into scatter graphs? Do you analyse it with things like Spearman's rank? What are the advantages and disadvantages, more specifically, of different types of data presentation technique? Analysing the data. Can you take the data you've collected and presented and tell me what it means. You know, how does it help you answer what you were trying to investigate? What conclusions can you draw from the data? And can you evaluate your investigation? You know, what went wrong? What could you improve? How could you make it more reliable? So there's going to be a mixture of questions about your physical fieldwork. Some of them will be about your fieldwork specifically. They will say in the question, how did you collect your data? Okay, you will need to know specifically how you collected your rivers data. You can't just waffle on and say, well, you could collect data in this way. You need to say, we did this. But it will also ask you some questions about general fieldwork skills. So with regards to maybe data presentation, you may not have used a scatter graph, but it might show you a scatter graph and say, what's the disadvantage of this? So you need to be aware of all the different types of presentation method, even if you haven't used them for your fieldwork. And it might also ask you about other geographical skills, things like annotating photographs. But again, there is another PowerPoint, lucky you, in these revision PowerPoint sessions, which looks at geographical skills, including map skills, graphical skills, and numerical skills, to name just three. So that's section A. Section B also has two options, and again, you don't do rural settlements. I've just crossed that off straight away. You will answer changes in the CBD as your human fieldwork. So again, worth 18 with an 8-mark question in there. Same sections as the rivers and physical environment section. It's about formulating inquiry questions and theory, methods of data collection and sampling, data presentation techniques and their disadvantages, analysing data conclusions and evaluations. So there will also be that mixture of questions about your fieldwork going to Norwich, general fieldwork skills and other geographical skills in general. So the sections really are the same, but you need to know your fieldwork really, really well. You'll be expected to go on the fieldwork days. There won't be a case of, I couldn't make that day, so I'm not doing that. If you do, you're at a massive disadvantage because you won't know the answers to questions they will ask you in the paper. So you have to go on the fieldwork. If you happen to miss that day, you'll need to see a member of the geography department, and we'll give you the equipment and tell you how to go and investigate the information, the fieldwork yourself, and you should do that because it's vital for you in the exam. Now, the last section comes away from fieldwork and looks at, again, sort of taught geography sections. And this is worth quite a big chunk of the marks for this paper, 28 of them to be exact. So those 28 marks include 4 for spelling, punctuation, grammar and specialist terms. And those marks will be added to one 12-mark discuss question. Now, this is the only time you will get a question bigger than an 8-mark question throughout all 3 papers, and it will be the last question on all of them. So when you finish your GCSE Geography answering the biggest question, okay, it's 12 marks plus 4 for spag, so it's actually worth 16 in total. Now, again, there is a separate revision session recorded for how to answer the discuss question very specifically. So if you find yourself, once you've mastered the 8-mark questions, which really are the ones you should really go for, the discuss question is ever so slightly different with regards to what you need to include in it. So there is a separate PowerPoint, revision PowerPoint to help instruct you on that. So the 4 UK challenges that you will have questions about, and you won't necessarily ask you about all of them, it might just ask you about one of them, or it might just mix up 2 or 3. They could be about consumption and environmental challenges, population and economic challenges, landscape challenges, and climate change challenges. Now, all 4 of those challenges draw from content from all the other topics you've already revised for and learned from papers 1 and 2. So there's nothing massively new in there. There might be 1 or 2 new little elements and with a bit more of a UK focus, but a lot of the core principles, for example, landscape challenges, could look at developing national parks, but you'll be aware of things like rock type and where you might find lowland or upland landscapes in relation to landscape challenges and how humans have affected the UK's landscape through forestry, agriculture and settlement. So some of the landscape challenges will all already include information that you've covered from the rest of the course. So this paper really, or this part of the paper, is mainly about that 12-mark discuss question, actually worth 16 marks, where you have to really structure your question well and use resources. But like I say, there is a separate instructional PowerPoint which will help you through that. So I hope that's been useful for you. That sort of concludes the entire overview of all three papers. I know it's taken a while, but when you think that you're going to be sat down and answering them for several hours collectively, it's useful to know what you're up against. So how I would use this PowerPoint is just to watch it really carefully and then maybe go back to it the night before you're going to do paper one and look at the paper one section, because really that tells you exactly what you're going to be faced with as you start turning that first page, what things they might ask you about and where you're going to find your 8-mark questions appearing. So you shouldn't have any nasty surprises. Okay, hopefully that's been useful. Look out for the next GCSE revision PowerPoint tutorial session, and thank you very much for listening.